the demolition crew arrived at the old beach house on a cold March morning in 2025. The structure had stood vacant for 28 years, slowly rotting under the assault of salt air and Pacific storms. Frank Morrison, the site foreman, stood surveying the property with unease settling deep in his chest. He had lived on Whidbey Island his entire life, and everyone who had grown up here knew the story of the vanished honeymooners. As a teenager in 1997, he had been part of the civilian search party that combed the beaches and woods for weeks after they disappeared. The excavator rumbled to life, its mechanical arm extending toward the rear of the house, where the foundation had shifted dangerously. Frank watched as the machine began pulling away rotted deckboards, working methodically to avoid a sudden collapse. 2 hours into the demolition, one of the younger crew members, a man named Tyler, shouted from near the foundation. His voice carried a note of panic that made Frank's blood run cold. Frank made his way across the debris-strewn property, his boots crunching on broken glass and weathered wood. Tyler stood frozen, his face drained of color, staring down into a gap that had opened in the crawl space beneath the house. Frank knelt at the edge of the opening, pulling a flashlight from his tool belt. He aimed the beam into the darkness beneath the house, and his breath caught in his throat. In the narrow crawl space, barely 3 feet high, two shapes lay side by side. Even after 28 years, the remains were unmistakable. Two human skeletons, still clothed in rotted fabric. Beside them, a rusted metal toolbox and what appeared to be a camera, its lens cracked but intact. Frank's hands trembled as he dialed 911. When the operator answered, he forced his voice to remain steady despite the hammering of his heart. "This is Frank Morrison at the old seaside property on Driftwood Lane. We've found human remains. 2 bodies. I think we just found Rebecca and Daniel Foster." The young couple had checked into the beachfront rental for their honeymoon on June 21st, 1997. 7 days later, their suitcases were found neatly packed by the door, breakfast dishes washed and stacked in the drying rack, and the beach house locked from the inside. But Rebecca and Daniel were gone, vanished without a trace. For 28 years, their disappearance remained one of Washington State's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Then, in March 2025, a construction crew demolishing the old beach house made a discovery that would finally reveal the horrifying truth about what happened during those 7 days in paradise. If you're captivated by true crime mysteries and stories of long-buried secrets, subscribe to Ultimate Crime Stories for more chilling investigations into cases that time forgot. The house had stood alone at the northern tip of Whidbey Island, where the beach gave way to jagged rocks, and the Pacific Ocean crashed against the shore with relentless fury. Rebecca Foster née Brennan was 27 years old when she arrived there in June of 1997. She was a marine researcher working for the Seattle Aquarium, passionate about ocean conservation and dedicated to her work. Daniel Foster was 29, a high school biology teacher beloved by his students for his patience and genuine enthusiasm for the natural world. They had met at a lecture on marine ecosystems 2 years earlier, connected instantly over their shared love of the ocean, and married in an intimate ceremony with just their closest family and friends present. The beach house had seemed like the perfect honeymoon destination. The seaside cottage, as it was called in the rental listing, promised isolation for privacy, but was close enough to the small town of Langley that they could walk to restaurants and shops when they wanted. The listing had shown a charming cedar-shingled cottage with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean, a stone fireplace, and a wraparound deck. What the listing hadn't mentioned was how the wind made the house groan at night, or how the nearest neighbor was almost 2 miles down the beach, or how the property manager, Thomas Wickham, would watch them with an intensity that made Rebecca deeply uncomfortable. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, the sun brilliant overhead, seagulls crying as they wheeled through the cloudless sky. Thomas Wickham met them at the property, a man in his mid-50s with weathered skin and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail. He showed them around the cottage, pointing out the features with professional courtesy, but Rebecca noticed how his gaze kept returning to her, how he stood just a little too close when explaining how to operate the fireplace, how his hand lingered on hers when he gave her the keys. "Did you notice how he stared?" she asked Daniel after Wickham had finally left, after his truck had disappeared down the long gravel driveway. Daniel shrugged, already unpacking their bags. "He's probably just protective of his property. Some owners are like that." Rebecca wanted to believe him, but something about the way Wickham had lingered in the doorway, his eyes following her movements as she unpacked, had sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. The first 2 days were everything they had hoped for. They walked the beach hand in hand, collected shells and sea glass, explored the tide pools at low tide, where Rebecca pointed out sea anemones and tiny crabs with the enthusiasm of someone who had never lost her wonder at the ocean's secrets. They made love in the big bed with the windows open, falling asleep to the sound of waves. They cooked simple meals together in the small kitchen, drank wine on the deck, as the sun set in spectacular displays of orange and purple and gold. Rebecca took photographs constantly, documenting their happiness, capturing Daniel's smile, the way the light played on the water, the perfect isolation of their temporary paradise. On their third day, Tuesday, June 23rd, they walked down the beach to meet their nearest neighbor. Martha Quinn was an elderly woman who had lived in her small cottage for 40 years. She was kind and welcoming, inviting them in for tea and homemade cookies. They talked about the island, about the best spots for watching whales, about the walking trails through the coastal forest. As they were leaving, Rebecca mentioned casually that she thought someone had been watching their house the previous night. Martha's expression changed, her weathered face growing serious. Watching, she asked, "What do you mean?" Rebecca described how she had seen a figure standing in the dunes beyond their property line just after dark, how the figure had remained motionless for long minutes before melting back into the darkness. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. "You should report that," she said, "to the police, or at least to the property manager. Don't dismiss it." Daniel tried to reassure both women. "It was probably just another beachgoer," he said. "Someone out for an evening walk." But Martha shook her head slowly. "People don't stand and stare at houses for no reason," she said quietly. "Trust your instincts, dear." That night, Rebecca couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. She kept getting up to check the windows, to peer out into the darkness beyond the deck. And there, just after midnight, she saw it again. A figure standing in the dunes, barely visible in the starlight, absolutely still. She woke Daniel, and together they watched. But when Daniel moved toward the sliding glass door to go outside and confront whoever it was, the figure disappeared into the night like smoke. The next morning, Wednesday, June 24th, they found footprints. Boot prints in the sand directly below their bedroom window, as if someone had stood there looking in while they slept. Rebecca felt her skin crawl, felt violation settle into her bones. Daniel called the rental agency, spoke to a woman who promised someone would come check on the property, but her tone suggested she thought they were being paranoid city people unused to the isolation of island life. Rebecca began documenting everything with her camera. She photographed the footprints, photographed the view from the deck, where she had seen the figure, kept the camera close at all times. That evening, as dusk fell, she saw him again. This time she was ready. She grabbed her camera and stepped out onto the deck, and there he was, closer than before, standing at the very edge of their property. She raised the camera and pressed the shutter, and in that moment before the flash fired, she saw his face clearly. A heavy-set man, with an unkempt beard and eyes that reflected the dying light like an animal's. The flash went off, and he didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there staring at her. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and held up a key. A silver key that caught the last rays of sunlight. He was showing her that he could get inside whenever he wanted. Rebecca stumbled backward into the house, her heart hammering, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the camera. Daniel locked every door and window, pushed furniture against the entrances, and they stayed up through the night, jumping at every sound, every creak of the old house settling. As dawn broke on Thursday, June 25th, they made the decision to leave. Just pack everything and go, abandon the last 3 days of their honeymoon, and get off this island where someone was clearly tormenting them. But when Daniel went out to load their car, he found the battery dead. Not run down, but deliberately disconnected, the cables lying on the ground beside the engine. And when Rebecca tried to call for help, she discovered that the phone line to the cottage had been cut. They were 2 miles from the nearest neighbor with no way to communicate and no way to leave until the next ferry, which wouldn't arrive until Friday morning. They were trapped, and whoever was watching them knew it. Thomas Wickham arrived at the cottage late Thursday morning, responding finally to their call from the day before. He was apologetic about the delay, claimed he had been dealing with other properties, other emergencies. He walked through the cottage slowly, examining windows and doors, checking locks with what seemed like excessive thoroughness. Everything seemed secure, he told them, his pale eyes moving over Rebecca in a way that made her want to hide. "You're perfectly safe here. I'm sure you just saw another guest, someone staying at one of the other properties. The island can feel isolated at night. It plays tricks on your mind." But Rebecca had shown him the photographs. She had shown him the picture of the man at their property line, the man holding up the key. Wickham had studied the photo for a long time, his expression unreadable. "I don't know who this is," he said finally, "but I'll look into it. In the meantime, you have my number. Call me if anything else happens." He left, and Rebecca watched his truck disappear down the driveway with a sinking feeling that he wasn't going to help them, that perhaps he couldn't, or worse, that he wouldn't. They spent Thursday afternoon preparing for another night. Daniel found tools in a shed behind the cottage and used them to reinforce the doors. They moved the bed away from the windows, gathered supplies into the main living area where they could barricade themselves. They talked about swimming down the beach to Martha Quinn's house, about hiking through the woods to reach town, but both options seemed too dangerous, with someone clearly watching their every move, waiting for them to be vulnerable. As darkness fell on Thursday night, they sat together on the couch in front of the cold fireplace, too afraid to light it in case the smoke obscured their view of the property. Daniel held Rebecca close, and they talked about their future, about the children they wanted to have, about the house they would buy, about growing old together. It was both beautiful and heartbreaking, this inventory of dreams, because some part of both of them understood that their future was slipping away with every passing hour. At 2 in the morning, they heard the sound of the door handle being tested. Slowly, carefully, someone was trying to get in. Daniel stood, grabbed the fireplace poker, positioned himself between Rebecca and the door. The handle stopped moving. Silence fell, thick and oppressive. Then they heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking around the perimeter of the house, testing each window, each door, methodically checking for a way in. The footsteps stopped at the back door, the one that led from the kitchen to the deck. They heard scratching, the sound of metal on metal. Someone was picking the lock. Daniel moved toward the door, and Rebecca grabbed her camera, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The door swung open slowly, and a figure filled the doorway. The same man from the photographs, but now inside their space, invading their sanctuary. Daniel shouted at him to get out, raised the poker threateningly, but the man just smiled. A slow, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said nothing, just stood there, and then from behind them came another sound. A second person had gotten in through the front door while they were focused on the back. Rebecca spun around, raised her camera, and in the flash of the photograph, she saw him. Thomas Wickham, the property manager, standing in their living room with a cloth in his hand, something chemical-smelling dripping from it. What happened next was chaos and terror and the desperate struggle of 2 people fighting for their lives. But Rebecca and Daniel Foster were both slight of build, academics who spent their time in labs and classrooms, not fighters. And their attackers were methodical, practiced, prepared. The last thing Rebecca remembered with any clarity was the chemical smell overwhelming her senses, Daniel's hand slipping from hers as darkness closed in, and the terrible certainty that they were going to die in this place that should have been their paradise. She woke in absolute darkness, her head pounding, her mouth dry. She couldn't move her arms, couldn't move her legs. It took her several seconds to understand that she was bound, rope cutting into her wrists and ankles. She tried to scream, but the sound came out muffled, something tied around her mouth. She thrashed, panic overwhelming rational thought, and felt her shoulder connect with something warm. Daniel. He was beside her, also bound, also gagged, also waking into nightmare. They were in the crawl space beneath the house. Rebecca understood this when her eyes adjusted enough to make out the wooden beams inches above her head, when she felt the damp earth beneath her, when she heard the sound of footsteps on the floor above them, walking calmly through their cottage. She could hear voices, muffled by the floorboards, but audible. The heavy-set man in Wickham, talking about securing the entrance, about making sure there were no signs of struggle, about arranging the cottage to look like they had simply left. Rebecca felt for Daniel in the darkness, and his bound hands found hers. They held on to each other as the voices above them continued their terrible work. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. It could have been hours or minutes. But eventually, the voices stopped. The footsteps faded. And then came a sound that made Rebecca's blood turn to ice. The grinding of wood on wood as something heavy was dragged over the entrance to the crawl space. The entrance being sealed. And then the unmistakable sound of hammering. They were being entombed. Daniel fought against his bonds with renewed desperation, and Rebecca did the same, but the ropes were too tight, cutting into their skin, drawing blood. She could feel the crawl space growing smaller, could feel the air growing thinner. Her training as a scientist told her they had hours at most before the oxygen ran out. Hours to lie in darkness, bound and helpless, knowing they were going to suffocate while their killers walked free above them. But then her hand, scrabbling desperately in the dirt, found something. The camera. Wickham must have thrown it down here with them, perhaps thinking it was just another piece of their belongings to be hidden away. Rebecca's fingers, still bound, but with enough mobility to grasp, closed around it. She couldn't see to aim it, couldn't see anything at all, but she pressed the shutter anyway. The flash fired, blinding in the absolute darkness, and for one terrible second, she saw everything. The wooden beams inches from their faces, the packed earth floor, Daniel's face beside her, his eyes wide with terror and love and apology. She took another picture, and another documenting their tomb, leaving evidence for whoever might eventually find them. The air grew steadily thinner. Their breathing became labored, each inhalation requiring more effort than the last. Rebecca felt lightheaded, felt the world starting to slip away from her. She pressed close to Daniel, felt his bound hands squeeze hers one last time. And then darkness came, final and absolute, swallowing them whole. 7 days after Rebecca and Daniel Foster checked into the seaside cottage, the rental agency sent someone to check on the property. The couple's rental period had ended, but they hadn't checked out, hadn't responded to calls. The property manager who arrived found the cottage locked from the inside, exactly as it should be. The dishes were washed and put away. The suitcases were packed and waiting by the door. The bed was made. Everything was neat and orderly, as if the couple had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation that followed was massive. Police brought in search dogs that tracked the couple sent to the beach, but then lost it. Volunteers combed the island for weeks, searching every hiking trail, every stretch of coastline, every abandoned building. The Coast Guard searched the waters, thinking perhaps they had been swept out to sea. Thomas Wickham was questioned extensively, but he had an alibi. Multiple witnesses placed him in Seattle during the critical period, attending property management conferences, eating at restaurants, staying in hotels. His alibi was airtight, documented, unshakable. The heavy-set man with the beard was harder to identify. No one seemed to know who Rebecca had photographed. The camera had never been found in the initial investigation, so there was no picture to show witnesses. The case grew cold. Theories proliferated. Some thought the couple had staged their own disappearance, though no evidence supported this. Others believed they had been victims of a random crime, killed and their bodies hidden somewhere on the island that the searchers had missed. Still others whispered about darker possibilities, about the island itself claiming victims, about curses and supernatural forces. Rebecca's sister, Hannah Brennan, was 26 years old when her sister disappeared. She had been finishing her doctorate in psychology at the University of Washington, planning to specialize in trauma and grief counseling. After Rebecca vanished, Hannah's focus shifted entirely. She threw herself into the search, spending months on Whidbey Island, walking the same beaches her sister had walked, searching for any clue that might explain what happened. When the official investigation was scaled back, Hannah continued alone, returning to the island every year on the anniversary of the disappearance, never giving up hope that somehow, somewhere, she would find answers. The years passed slowly. Hannah eventually completed her doctorate, established a practice in Seattle, but never married, never had children. How could she, when her sister's fate remained unknown? How could she move forward when Rebecca might still be out there somewhere, waiting to be found? The not knowing was its own special kind of torture, worse in many ways than grief, because grief at least had finality. Hannah existed in a state of permanent suspension, unable to fully mourn, unable to fully live. 28 years. That's how long it took for the truth to finally surface. 28 years of silence from the seaside cottage. 28 years of the beach house slowly rotting at the northern tip of Whidbey Island. 28 years of Hannah wondering and searching and hoping against hope. And then Frank Morrison's demolition crew arrived on that cold March morning in 2025 and tore away the deck boards and revealed what had been hidden below for nearly 3 decades. Detective Lauren Pierce was 43 years old, a 15-year veteran of the Whidbey Island Sheriff's Department. She had been too young to work on the original investigation in 1997, but she knew the case. Everyone in Washington law enforcement knew the case. The vanished honeymooners had become something of a legend, a cautionary tale, an unsolved mystery that haunted everyone who had worked on it. When Frank Morrison's call came in, when the words human remains and 2 bodies crackled over the radio, Lauren felt her heart rate spike with the terrible certainty that they had finally found Rebecca and Daniel Foster. The forensic team worked through the afternoon and evening, carefully extracting the remains from beneath the house. The positioning of the bodies struck Lauren as significant. They were lying side by side, their skeletal hands close together as if they had been holding on to each other in their final moments. The ropes that had bound them had mostly decomposed, but fragments remained, enough to tell the story. They had been tied up, drugged based on the preliminary examination, and sealed into the crawl space alive. The camera was the key piece of evidence. It was an older model, the kind that used actual film rather than digital storage. The film inside was damaged, water and time having taken their toll, but it wasn't destroyed. The forensic lab in Seattle rushed the processing, using special techniques to recover whatever images might have survived. Of the 36 exposures on the roll, 9 were recoverable enough to provide information. The first few images were what you would expect from a honeymoon. Rebecca and Daniel on the deck, smiling at the camera, the ocean sparkling behind them. Pictures of them walking on the beach, collecting shells, watching the sunset. Images of happiness and love, and a future that stretched out before them full of promise. But then the tone of the photographs changed. Picture number 6 showed the view from the deck at twilight, and there in the background, partially hidden behind a clump of beach grass, was a figure. A man standing motionless, watching the house. Picture number 7 was similar, but taken from a different angle, perhaps through a window. The same figure, closer now, his posture suggesting surveillance rather than casual beach walking. Picture number 8 made Lauren's blood run cold. It showed the sliding glass door from inside the cottage at night, and pressed against the glass, looking in, was a face. The camera flash had caught it perfectly, freezing the moment. A heavy-set man with an unkempt beard and intense eyes. And in his hand, clearly visible, he held a key. Picture number 9 was chaotic, blurred by motion, clearly taken in panic. It showed a section of the cottage floor, and in the corner of the frame, a pair of boots. Someone was inside the house with them. But it was the final 3 images that told the most horrifying part of the story. They were dark, almost completely black, but the camera flash had illuminated just enough to understand. Wooden beams inches away. Packed earth. And in the last photograph, Rebecca's bound hand reaching toward the camera lens, Daniel's arm visible beside her, both of them in the crawl space, both of them documenting their own tomb in the desperate hope that someone someday would find the evidence and understand what had happened to them. Lauren had the photographs enhanced, had the face in the window compared against every database available. And eventually, they got a match. The man in the photograph was Raymond Keller, a maintenance worker who had lived on Whidbey Island his entire life. Keller had worked for multiple property owners, including the owner of the seaside cottage. He had keys to dozens of rental properties. He had legitimate reasons to be on the grounds, to enter the houses, to move through the island community without raising suspicion. And he had died in 2004, 7 years after Rebecca and Daniel Foster disappeared, died of a heart attack in his trailer on the south end of the island, taking his secrets with him to the grave. But had he taken all his secrets? That was the question that consumed Lauren in the days following the discovery. If Keller was responsible for killing Rebecca and Daniel, had he killed others? The placement of the bodies, the methodical nature of the crime, the documentation through photography, all suggested this wasn't his first time. Serial killers didn't just suddenly appear fully formed. They developed their patterns over time, refined their methods, grew bolder with each success. If Keller had killed before, there might be other victims, other families who deserved answers. The call came to Hannah Brennan on a Wednesday afternoon. She was in her office in Seattle between clients, reviewing notes for an upcoming session. When her phone rang and she saw the Whidbey Island area code, her heart stuttered. 28 years of hoping and dreading in equal measure had trained her to recognize that area code instantly. She answered, and the voice on the other end was professional but gentle. "Miss Brennan, this is Detective Lauren Pierce with the Whidbey Island Sheriff's Department. I need to inform you that we've discovered human remains at the seaside cottage property. We're still in the process of formal identification, but the circumstances strongly suggest these are the remains of your sister and her husband." Hannah didn't remember hanging up the phone, didn't remember the rest of her appointments that day. She found herself in her car, driving toward the ferry terminal, operating on autopilot while her mind tried to process what she had just learned. After 28 years, Rebecca had been found. After 28 years of searching and hoping and imagining every possible scenario, the answer had been right there all along. Rebecca had never left the island. She had died within days of arriving, had spent the last 28 years hidden in darkness, just feet below the house where she had laughed and made love and dreamed of her future. The ferry crossing to Whidbey Island took 2 hours, and Hannah spent them staring out at the water, remembering. She remembered Rebecca as a child, fearless and curious, bringing home injured birds and stray cats, determined to save everything. She remembered Rebecca in college, passionate about marine biology, talking for hours about ocean conservation and the interconnectedness of ecosystems. She remembered Rebecca on her wedding day, radiant in a simple white dress, looking at Daniel like he was her entire world. And she remembered the last time she had seen her sister alive, the day before the honeymoon, when Rebecca had hugged her tight and said, "When I get back, I'll tell you all about it. I promise." But Rebecca hadn't come back. And now Hannah understood why. The sheriff's department was located in Coupeville, the island's main town. Lauren Pierce met Hannah in the parking lot, and Hannah was struck by how young the detective looked, how kind her eyes were. They shook hands, and Lauren led Hannah inside to a small conference room. "The formal identification will take time," Lauren explained. "We're using dental records and DNA. But Miss Brennan, I want to be honest with you. The circumstances match your sister's disappearance exactly. The location, the timeline, the evidence we've recovered. I'm very sorry for your loss." Hannah nodded slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "How did they die?" "Asphyxiation. The medical examiner believes they were trapped in the crawl space and ran out of air. Based on the size of the space and other factors, death would have occurred within hours." Hannah closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. She had spent 28 years imagining different scenarios, but somehow this was worse than anything she had pictured. The idea of Rebecca trapped in darkness, unable to escape, slowly suffocating, was almost more than she could bear. "There's something else," Lauren continued gently. "We found a camera with the remains. We've recovered 9 photographs from the film inside. They show that your sister and her husband were aware they were being watched in the days before they disappeared. They documented a man surveilling the property, and the final images suggest they knew they were in danger. Would you like to see these photographs?" Hannah wiped her eyes and nodded. "Yes. I need to see everything." Lauren opened a laptop and pulled up the files. Hannah looked at the first image, saw Rebecca and Daniel on the deck, and had to suppress a sob. They looked so happy, so completely unaware of what was coming. She moved through the images chronologically, watching the story unfold. The figure in the dunes, the face at the window, the final desperate shots from inside the crawl space. When she reached the last photograph, the one showing Rebecca's bound hand reaching toward the camera, Hannah broke down completely, her body shaking with sobs that had been held back for 28 years. Lauren waited patiently, a box of tissues at hand, her presence solid and supportive. When Hannah could finally speak again, she asked the question that mattered most. Who did this? Who was the man in the photographs? His name was Raymond Keller, Lauren said. He was a maintenance worker who had access to the property. We've confirmed his identity through facial recognition. Unfortunately, Keller died in 2004, so he can't be brought to justice. But Miss Brennan, we believe there may be more to this case. We're investigating the possibility that Keller was responsible for other disappearances on the island. Hannah looked up sharply. Other victims? We're not sure yet. But we're searching Keller's last known residence, looking for any evidence that might connect him to other cases. I promise you, we're going to find out everything we can about what happened to your sister and why. Raymond Keller's property was located on the southern tip of Whidbey Island, down a rutted dirt road that wound through dense forest. The trailer he had lived in was a rusted hulk, barely standing, surrounded by blackberry brambles and tall grass. The county had seized the property for unpaid taxes after Keller's death, but no one had ever done anything with it. It had simply sat there for 20 years, slowly returning to the forest, holding its secrets. Lauren Pierce arrived at the property with a full forensic team, search warrant in hand, prepared to spend days combing through the debris. Hannah had insisted on coming along, and Lauren had eventually agreed, with a strict understanding that Hannah would stay outside the perimeter and not touch anything. The team began methodically searching the trailer, documenting everything, bagging potential evidence. It was Hannah who made the first significant discovery, and she made it by accident. She was standing near the trailer, looking at the ground, trying to imagine what kind of person had lived here, what kind of mind could conceive of the horrors inflicted on her sister. She shifted her weight and felt the ground beneath her foot give slightly. She looked down and saw that she was standing on a piece of plywood, partially obscured by dirt and dead grass. She called out to Lauren, and within minutes, the forensic team was carefully lifting the plywood away to reveal a false floor. Beneath the plywood was a shallow cavity, maybe 2 feet deep and 4 feet square. And in that cavity were the remnants of other lives. A woman's earring with a distinctive turquoise stone. A student identification card, water damaged but still legible, showing a smiling blonde woman named Jennifer Cross from the University of Oregon, dated 1988. A man's watch with an inscription on the back, the words worn but readable, to Marcus, with love, Lisa. A driver's license for someone named David Patterson from Portland, dated 1992. And cameras, 3 of them, older models that predated digital technology. Lauren looked at Hannah, and both women understood immediately what they were seeing. These were trophies. Keller had kept items from his victims, had hidden them away in this secret compartment where he could return to them, where he could relive whatever he had done. The items were carefully bagged and documented, and the team continued their search. Behind the trailer, almost hidden by vegetation, was a shed. It was larger than expected, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with no windows and a heavy padlock on the door. More significantly, there was a generator running beside it, its steady hum audible once you got close enough. Why would there be a generator running at an abandoned property? Lauren wondered aloud. The team cut the padlock and opened the shed door, and what they found inside defied belief. The interior had been converted into a darkroom, with chemical baths and developing equipment set up on a workbench. Clotheslines stretched across the ceiling, presumably for hanging photographs to dry. And against the far wall stood 3 old refrigerators, all running, all powered by the generator outside. Lauren approached the first refrigerator and opened it carefully. Inside, organized on glass shelves, were dozens of film canisters, each labeled with dates and brief descriptions. She pulled out one canister at random. The label read, July 1983, couple from California, beach house rental. Another canister, June 1989, solo traveler, blonde, cottage on Shore Road. There were hundreds of them, filling all 3 refrigerators, spanning from the early 1980s to 2003, a year before Keller's death. Hannah stood in the doorway of the shed, her hand over her mouth, staring at the canisters. Each one represented someone Keller had watched, someone he had documented, someone whose life he had invaded. And some of them, perhaps many of them, represented people who had never left the island, people who had disappeared just like Rebecca and Daniel, people whose families had spent years wondering and searching and hoping. The forensic lab worked around the clock to develop the film from Keller's collection. What emerged was a horrifying chronicle of surveillance and obsession. The photographs showed couple after couple, individual after individual, tourists and visitors who had come to Whidbey Island for vacation and found themselves being stalked by a predator they never saw coming. Early photographs were relatively innocuous, distant shots of people on the beach or walking through town. But as the years progressed, the photographs became more invasive. Shots taken through windows, images of people sleeping, couples in intimate moments, all captured without consent or knowledge. Lauren and her team began the painstaking process of trying to identify the people in the photographs and cross-referencing them with missing persons reports. The FBI was brought in, their databases and resources dedicated to solving what was rapidly becoming clear as one of the most extensive serial murder cases in Pacific Northwest history. Special Agent Victoria Martinez arrived from Seattle with a team of forensic specialists, and together they began to piece together the full scope of Raymond Keller's crimes. The personal items from the hidden compartment beneath the trailer were tested for DNA and compared against databases of missing persons. Jennifer Cross, the woman whose student ID had been found, was confirmed as having disappeared from Whidbey Island in August of 1988. She had been vacationing with friends, and one night she had gone for a walk on the beach alone and never returned. Her body had never been found. Marcus Chun, whose name was inscribed on the watch, had disappeared along with his girlfriend, Lisa Wong, in June of 1991. They had been visiting the island for a long weekend, staying at a beach rental, and had vanished on their last night there. David Patterson, the man whose driver's license was found, had been reported missing in September of 1992. He was a recently divorced man who had rented a cottage for a week of solitude and reflection. He too had never been seen again. The pattern became clear. Keller had been targeting tourists and visitors for over 15 years, watching them, documenting them, and in at least some cases, killing them. The full count of victims was difficult to establish because not everyone who disappeared was necessarily one of his victims. Some people genuinely did have accidents, did drown in the strong currents, did fall from the rocky cliffs. But the evidence suggested that at a minimum, Keller was responsible for at least 7 deaths, possibly more. But there was something else in the film canisters that troubled Lauren deeply. Some of the photographs showed angles and perspectives that would have been impossible for one person to achieve alone. In several sets of images, there were shots taken simultaneously from different positions, suggesting at least 2 photographers working in coordination. Equipment manifests found in Keller's trailer showed purchases of heavy-duty items that would have required 2 people to transport and operate. And most significantly, in one of the developed photographs, you could see reflected in a window the shadow of a second person, someone standing behind the camera operator, someone else watching. Lauren brought this evidence to Agent Martinez, and together they began searching for any indication of who Keller's partner might have been. They found references in receipts and notes to someone with the initials RG. Purchases made jointly. Notations about RG shift and RG watching north approach. Raymond Keller hadn't been working alone. He had an accomplice, someone who had helped him stalk and kill innocent people for over a decade. And unlike Keller, who had died in 2004, this person might still be alive. The search through county records and interviews with longtime island residents eventually produced a name. Robert Granger. He had lived on Whidbey Island from the late 1970s through 2003, had worked odd jobs around the island, and had been known as Raymond Keller's closest friend. According to people who remembered him, Granger and Keller were inseparable, working together on various projects, spending their free time together, living parallel lives of isolation and oddness that had made them outcasts in the small island community. Robert Granger had left Whidbey Island abruptly in August of 2003, shortly after Raymond Keller's death. He had sold his property quickly, taken a loss on the sale, and vanished. The last official record of him was a missing persons report he had filed on August 15, 2003, claiming that Raymond Keller had disappeared and he was concerned about his friend's welfare. But Keller's body had been found by a postal worker on August 12th. 3 days before Granger filed the report. Granger had been creating a paper trail, establishing that he was worried about Keller, that he had no knowledge of his friend's death. It was a clumsy attempt at misdirection, but it had worked well enough that no one had looked too closely at Granger at the time. Now, 22 years later, finding Robert Granger became the investigation's top priority. He would be 74 years old if he was still alive. The FBI put out bulletins, checked Social Security records, searched for any indication that Granger was collecting benefits or had interaction with any government agency. But there was nothing. Robert Granger had gone to ground in 2003 and had stayed there. Hannah Brennan couldn't sit still while the investigation proceeded at what felt like an agonizingly slow pace. She printed out copies of Robert Granger's last known photograph, taken from his driver's license in 2001. It showed a thin man with dark hair and intense eyes, a face that looked ordinary enough, but somehow suggested an inner coldness. Hannah walked through the towns of Whidbey Island, showing the photograph to shopkeepers and restaurant workers, to anyone who would look, asking if they had seen this man recently. Most people shook their heads, unable to help. But at a small hardware store in Oak Harbor, the elderly clerk studied the photograph for a long time, his weathered brow furrowed in concentration. "I know him," he said finally. "I mean, I've seen someone who looks like him. But that's not the name he used." Hannah's heart began to race. "When did you see him? What name did he give?" The clerk thought carefully. "About 6 months ago, maybe 7. He came in here and bought some tools, rope, a flashlight, couple other things. Paid cash. Said his name was Robert Gaines. I remember because I thought it was odd, buying that particular combination of items. And he had this intensity about him, you know? Made me uncomfortable." Hannah immediately called Detective Pierce with this information, and within hours, every rental agency on Whidbey Island was being contacted. They were looking for anyone who had rented property under the name Robert Gaines, anyone matching the physical description, anyone who had paid in cash and kept a low profile. They found 3 possible matches, all properties rented within the last year to men who fit the general description and who had maintained minimal contact with the property owners. The third property they checked was a small cabin on the southeast part of the island, isolated and surrounded by dense forest. It had been rented 9 months earlier to a man calling himself Robert Gaines. The property owner, an elderly woman who lived in Seattle, said she had only met the tenant once, when he paid the first month's rent in cash. After that, he had left cash in her mailbox on the first of each month and had never contacted her for any reason. The last time she had driven by the property, about a month ago, she had seen lights on, but no vehicle in the driveway. Lauren Pierce assembled a tactical team and approached the cabin with extreme caution. Robert Granger, if this was indeed him, had helped Raymond Keller kill multiple people. He was potentially armed and definitely dangerous. The team surrounded the cabin, established a perimeter, and Lauren used a bullhorn to call out, "Robert Granger, this is the police. Come out with your hands visible." The cabin remained dark and silent. After several minutes of no response, the tactical team breached the door. The cabin was empty, but what they found inside made it clear that Robert Granger had indeed been living there. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, creating a shrine that was both memorial and continuation of horror. Every photograph was of Raymond Keller. Keller at different ages, from young adulthood through his 50s. Candid shots, posed portraits, pictures that suggested deep intimacy and obsession. This wasn't just friendship or partnership. This was devotion bordering on worship. But it was the back room of the cabin that revealed the most disturbing truth. The small bedroom had been converted into a workspace, and on a large table were maps of Whidbey Island, surveillance photographs, and notes. The surveillance photographs were recent, taken within the last few months. They showed current island residents, tourists, visitors, people going about their daily lives, completely unaware they were being watched and documented. Robert Granger hadn't stopped after Raymond Keller died. He had continued the pattern, kept watching, kept documenting, kept selecting potential victims. On the wall was a calendar, and one date was circled in red. June 21st, 2025. Tomorrow's date. Written beside it in neat handwriting. New honeymooners arrive. Raymond would have been pleased. Lauren felt ice flood her veins. She immediately got on the radio to the command center. "I need a list of every couple checking into rental properties on this island today or tomorrow. Priority is newly married couples. Anyone on a honeymoon. Move now." The call came back within minutes. There was one couple matching that description. Emma and Jack Rodriguez from Portland, married 3 weeks ago, had rented a beach house on Driftwood Lane for 1 week, checking in at 3 p.m. this afternoon. Driftwood Lane. Less than half a mile from where the seaside cottage had stood, less than half a mile from where Rebecca and Daniel Foster had died 28 years ago. Robert Granger was recreating Raymond Keller's most significant kill, and he was planning to do it today. Every available officer converged on the beach house, where the Rodriguez couple was due to arrive. Lauren tried calling them repeatedly, but every call went straight to voicemail. An officer was dispatched to the ferry terminal to intercept them if they hadn't arrived on the island yet. But the 3 p.m. ferry had already docked and unloaded its passengers. Emma and Jack Rodriguez were somewhere on Whidbey Island, heading toward a vacation rental, completely unaware that they had been selected by a killer. The tactical team set up positions around the beach house, hidden in the tree line, watching for any sign of either the Rodriguez couple or Robert Granger. The house itself was a newer construction, built 5 years ago on a lot that had once been part of a larger property. Lauren stood behind one of the patrol vehicles, her eyes scanning the area, every nerve on high alert. They were close now, so close to stopping Granger before he could hurt anyone else. But they needed to find him, and they needed to find him before he reached that house. Movement in the forest caught Lauren's attention. A figure barely visible among the trees, standing absolutely still, watching the beach house. Lauren raised her binoculars and felt recognition slam through her. The man in the trees, older and thinner now, but unmistakable, was Robert Granger. She spoke quietly into her radio. Suspect spotted, North Treeline, approximately 75 yards from the target house. All units move to intercept. Do not let him reach that house. The tactical team moved swiftly and silently, circling through the forest to approach Granger from multiple angles. But Granger saw them coming. Despite his age, despite the years, he moved with startling speed, turning and fleeing deeper into the woods. The pursuit was on, officers crashing through underbrush, shouting for him to stop, radios crackling with updates on his position. Lauren followed, her weapon drawn, her focus absolute. This man had helped kill her sister, had helped kill multiple people, had been planning to kill again. He was not getting away. The chase led them deeper into the forest, farther from the beach house and the road. The undergrowth was thick, the terrain uneven, roots and rocks creating obstacles that had to be navigated carefully. Lauren could hear Granger ahead of them, breaking through branches, his breathing labored and harsh. And then suddenly, the sound stopped. The team emerged into a clearing and found themselves on the edge of a cliff, the ground dropping away sharply to rocks and ocean 60 feet below. Robert Granger stood at the very edge, his back to the drop, facing the semicircle of officers who had surrounded him. His hands were empty, no weapon visible, but his stance was tense, coiled. Lauren moved slowly closer, her weapon still trained on him, but her voice steady and calm. "Robert Granger, you're under arrest. Put your hands where we can see them and step away from the edge." Granger looked at her, and his eyes were strange, distant, almost peaceful. "You're too late," he said quietly. "The cycle is complete." "What do you mean?" Lauren asked, still moving slowly closer. "Tell me where the other victims are buried. Tell me what you and Raymond Keller did." Granger smiled, and it was the coldest expression Lauren had ever seen. "Raymond and I protected this island. We kept it pure. The tourists, they come here and they take, they consume, they corrupt. We show them that some places are sacred, that some prices must be paid." "How many?" Lauren demanded. "How many people did you kill?" "I never killed anyone," Granger said, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "I watched, I documented, I helped Raymond prepare, but I never touched them. That was Raymond's work. I was the witness, the recorder of justice." "Where are the bodies?" Lauren pressed. "The families deserve to know." Granger turned slightly, looking out over the ocean. "The island keeps its secrets," he said. "Raymond knew special places, hidden places. Let the island keep some of its mysteries." And then, before anyone could react, before Lauren could close the distance between them, Robert Granger stepped backward off the edge of the cliff. There was no cry, no sound except the rush of wind, and then the terrible impact of his body hitting the rocks below. Lauren ran to the edge and looked down, already knowing what she would see. Granger lay motionless on the stones, waves beginning to wash over him as the tide came in. Whatever secrets he had kept, whatever knowledge he had about other victims and other crimes, he had taken with him. The recovery of Granger's body took several hours, requiring special equipment and Coast Guard assistance. By the time they brought him up from the rocks, it was early evening, the sun beginning to set over the Pacific Ocean. Hannah Brennan had arrived at the scene after hearing what happened, and she stood now on the beach, watching the recovery team work, feeling a strange mixture of relief and frustration. Granger was dead, unable to hurt anyone else, but he had also escaped justice, had denied the families of his victims the closure of a trial, of testimony, of answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. Detective Pierce approached Hannah as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know you wanted him to face trial." Hannah nodded slowly. "At least Emma and Jack Rodriguez are safe." "They never even knew they were in danger, did they?" "They arrived at the house about 30 minutes ago," Lauren confirmed. "We explained the situation to them as gently as possible. They've decided to cut their vacation short and go home tomorrow. I don't blame them." The two women stood in silence for a moment, watching the waves roll in, eternal and indifferent to human suffering. "What happens now?" Hannah finally asked. "Now we search for the other victims." Granger said the island keeps its secrets, but we have technology he and Keller never imagined. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, forensic archaeology. We'll find them, and the families will finally have answers. The search took 6 months. Teams with specialized equipment combed the areas around Raymond Keller's property, investigated locations mentioned in his journals, explored caves along the shoreline and dense sections of forest that matched descriptions from the photographs. They found remains in 5 different locations, hidden so carefully that they might have stayed hidden forever if not for the evidence left behind in Keller's shed. Each discovery brought closure to a family that had been waiting years, sometimes decades, for news. Jennifer Cross's remains were found in a small cave near the northern tip of the island, the turquoise earring still with her, allowing for immediate identification. Marcus Chun and Lisa Wong were found together, buried in a section of forest far from any trail, their remains confirming what their families had feared since 1991. David Patterson was discovered in a similar location, and 2 other sets of remains were found that matched missing persons reports from the 1980s. In total, Raymond Keller and Robert Granger were confirmed responsible for 13 deaths between 1983 and 1997. The FBI classified it as one of the most extensive serial murder conspiracies in Pacific Northwest history. The case dominated news cycles for months, bringing unwanted attention to Whidbey Island, casting a shadow over a community that had prided itself on being a safe, welcoming destination for tourists and visitors. But there was also healing. Families who had spent years in the agonizing limbo of not knowing finally had answers, could finally lay their loved ones to rest. Support groups formed, connecting those who had lost someone to Keller and Granger's crimes, providing space for shared grief and mutual understanding. And gradually, slowly, the island began to remember its dead while also working to reclaim its identity as a place of beauty and peace. Hannah Brennan made the decision to have Rebecca and Daniel buried on Whidbey Island rather than transporting their remains back to Seattle. It felt right somehow to let them rest in the place they had chosen for their honeymoon, in the place where they had been happy before everything went wrong. The burial was small and private, just close family and a few friends who had never forgotten. The gravestone was simple but elegant, carved from local granite. Rebecca Brennan Foster, 1970 to 1997, beloved daughter and sister. Daniel Foster, 1968 to 1997, beloved son and husband. Together forever. Hannah stood before the gravestone, tears streaming down her face, but feeling something like peace beginning to take root in the place where uncertainty had lived for so long. Detective Lauren Pierce attended the burial, standing quietly at the back of the small gathering, paying her respects to victims she had never met but had come to know through the investigation. Afterward, she approached Hannah, and the 2 women embraced, bound together now by their shared pursuit of justice for Rebecca and Daniel. Hannah stayed on Whidbey Island. She found a small cottage to rent in Langley, the main town, and began the process of transferring her psychology practice from Seattle. The island community needed mental health support, especially in the aftermath of the revelations about Keller and Granger. Families were struggling to process what had happened, to reconcile their memories of a safe island home with the reality of the predators who had operated there for so many years. Hannah could help with that. She could turn her own grief and trauma into something useful, could honor Rebecca's memory by helping others heal. She also spearheaded the creation of a memorial for all of Keller and Granger's victims. The Whidbey Island Memorial Garden was established on a peaceful plot of land overlooking the ocean, with 13 plaques arranged in a circle, each bearing the name of a victim and the dates of their birth and death. In the center of the circle was a larger stone with an inscription. They came seeking beauty. They found tragedy. We remember them. The dedication ceremony in December of 2025 brought together families from across the Pacific Northwest, united in their loss and their determination to ensure their loved ones would not be forgotten. Hannah visited Rebecca's grave every week, bringing wildflowers in the spring and summer, evergreen branches in the winter. She talked to her sister, told her about the memorial, about the families she was helping, about the slow process of healing. She talked about the life Rebecca should have had, the children she should have raised, the discoveries she should have made in her marine biology career. And she promised over and over that Rebecca's story would be remembered, that the horror of her death would serve as a reminder to stay vigilant, to trust instincts, to never assume that monsters couldn't exist in beautiful places. The seaside cottage property remained empty, the demolition finally completed, the land cleared. The owners, descendants of Thomas Wickham, who had himself died in 2015, decided to donate the land to the island community to become part of a nature preserve. The house where Rebecca and Daniel had spent their final days would never be rebuilt. Instead, it would return to nature, become again what it had been before humans built there, a windswept piece of coastline where waves crashed against rocks and seabirds wheeled through the sky. Hannah walked that beach one afternoon in early spring of 2026, almost exactly a year after Frank Morrison's demolition crew had made their terrible discovery. She stood where the house had been, where her sister had stood 29 years ago, watching the sun set over the Pacific. The beauty was still there, unchanged by human evil, indifferent to tragedy. The ocean still rolled in with its eternal rhythm. The wind still carried the salt smell she had described in her letters home. Paradise hadn't been destroyed by what happened here. It had simply been revealed as more complex than they had imagined, capable of holding both transcendent beauty and unspeakable horror. Hannah found a piece of sea glass half buried in the sand, worn smooth by decades of tide and time. She picked it up, feeling its cool weight in her palm. It was blue-green and translucent, beautiful in its simplicity. This piece of glass had probably started as something sharp and broken, perhaps a bottle thrown from a boat or left on the beach by a careless visitor. But the ocean had taken it, had tumbled it endlessly through sand and stone and water, had worn away the sharp edges until it became something almost beautiful, transformed by time and tide into something that no longer could cut, no longer could harm. Hannah closed her hand around the sea glass and looked out at the horizon where the sky met the water in an endless line. She thought about transformation, about how even the most broken things could eventually become something else, could be shaped by time into forms that were bearable, that were even, in their way, beautiful. She thought about how she had been broken by Rebecca's disappearance, how the not knowing had carved out a hollow space in her chest that nothing could fill. And she thought about how that hollow space was slowly being filled now, not with happiness exactly, not with the sister she had lost, but with purpose and memory and the knowledge that she had done everything possible to bring Rebecca home. The investigation was over. The killers were dead. The victims had been found and laid to rest. Justice, imperfect and incomplete as it always was, had been served as much as it ever could be. And Hannah Brennan, who had been 26 years old when her sister disappeared and was now 54, who had spent 28 years in a state of suspended grief, could finally begin to move forward. Not moving on, because you never moved on from losing someone you loved, but moving forward, carrying Rebecca with her always, keeping her memory alive while also allowing herself to live. She slipped the sea glass into her pocket and began walking back down the beach toward town. Behind her, the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples and reds. The same sunset Rebecca and Daniel had watched from the deck of the seaside cottage 29 years ago. The same sunset that had been there long before humans had arrived on this island, and would be there long after they were gone. In different beauty, eternal and unchanging, holding space for both joy and sorrow, for both love and loss. The story of Rebecca and Daniel Foster, and of all those who had disappeared into Raymond Keller and Robert Granger's darkness, was over. But its echoes would ripple through Whidbey Island for generations to come, a cautionary tale about the monsters that could hide in plain sight, about the importance of trusting instincts, about the necessity of looking closely at the world around us and seeing truly what was there. And it was a story about persistence, about a sister who never stopped searching, about investigators who never stopped trying to find the truth, about families who never stopped hoping for answers. Hannah reached the parking lot where her car was waiting and paused to look back one more time at the beach, at the place where her sister had died. The waves continued their endless rhythm against the shore, and the wind carried the cries of seagulls, and the world kept turning exactly as it always had. But Hannah Brennan was different now. She was no longer the woman suspended in uncertainty, no longer the sister who didn't know. She was someone who had found answers, who had brought her sister home, who had made sure that 13 people who had been forgotten were remembered. And that, she thought, was something. It wasn't everything, but it was something. If you want to hear more stories of mysteries finally solved, of families who never gave up searching, of truth emerging from decades of darkness, subscribe to Ultimate Crime Stories. Because everyone deserves to be remembered, and every story deserves to be told.